So, that said, so we'll go ahead and get started. We have, one panelist who we're still working to get in, has some tech problems, but, our panel will be in the back half of the time today. So hopefully we'll get that sorted out as we go through the keynote. I'll go ahead and get my screen shared and we'll get going. Great. So, first of all, thank you very much for coming out to our Healthcare and Life Sciences Forum today. I hope everyone has been having a great Spark Summit, and we've been running this this Healthcare and Life Sciences Forum since 2017. So this is, I think, our fourth year doing it, and every year is a bit different and a bit better. So we're very excited for what we have today. Just a couple of from a health side up front. We'll have everybody's connected. We'll have a by Q&A. So when you believe it and screen, you can question. You'll have a place that you will then present and will be available after today's presentation. So if you have a colleague or interested, I can refer here and able to and hopefully hear interest of that. Okay, I'm Frank, for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Databricks. I've been here since 2017. We kicked off Healthcare and Life Sciences team, and I work globally across all of our customers as well as with our internal engineering groups to go ahead and build out solutions and work to these on the challenges of higher healthcare value. In terms of the agenda today, kick off a brief keynote talking about some of the trends that we've seen, some of the lessons that we've learned from the last 6 months, and talk about where we're going in the back half of the year. After that, I'm very glad to have Julie Yu, who's the general partner and healthcare lead at Andreessen Horowitz, who will give a keynote talking about healthcare, the great unlock. And then we'll go ahead and transition to an industry panel where we'll talk about how companies in healthcare and life sciences can blend data and AI together to innovate the way that we deliver care, design therapeutics, and understand better the fundamental biology and trends that underlie disease. So we really appreciate everyone joining today. Thank you to our keynote speaker and to our 4 panelists, and we really appreciate everyone's participation. To go ahead and start off, we'll just talk for a second about some of the trends that we've seen going on the last few months. We'd be lying not to acknowledge that there's a global crisis going on, and what's really inspired me throughout this process is the way that it's pushed a lot of people to make rapid steps forward in terms of how we're working with data, how we're analyzing that data, and how we can use it to inform and improve our response to the ongoing global crisis. What we've seen, what's I think been really impressive and just really inspirational for many of us is that we've seen hospitals and research consortiums go ahead and stand up real-time analytics and AI capabilities overnight. Whether it is people out of academia, such as the tools that have come out of MIT, the tools that have come out of NYU that people have used to go ahead and understand which patients are at risk of developing COVID, which patients are at risk of having severe disease prediction. We've seen a lot of work in terms of people going ahead and starting to go ahead and roll out telemedicine capabilities. And obviously telemedicine is an area that has very, very strong data backings. There's kind of an unprecedented ability to go beyond what's available in the EHR and collect much more data in a much richer way that we can go ahead and start analyzing. On our side, we've been really thrilled to work with a number of our customers, some of whom you've heard speak at this conference, such as the team at the Medical University of South Carolina, the team at Indiana University Hospital, as well as a number of talks that you've heard from staff on our side at Databricks, as well as the mention in the keynote from the Rush University Medical Center. So we've been tremendously thrilled to stand beside many of these hospitals, many of these research consortiums, and to do what we can to help them leverage data and AI capabilities quickly. But when we look at this, there's a couple of trends that really made this possible. When we look at a lot of the work that's kind of happened as an open community in healthcare and the life sciences, there's a couple of trends that have come together. With COVID, this data was quickly made open access. You look at some of the data that has come out of Johns Hopkins, come out of the New York Times, come out of the Kaggle competitions to go ahead and classify, kind of the PubMed paper abstracts and other paper abstracts that are landing on sites like medRxiv and et cetera. This data rapidly came out in an open access, openly shareable form that people could quickly get to work on. Additionally, what was unique about this data is that a lot of people in the community spent a long time to go ahead and curate this data and clean it up. So it was easy for many people to go through and take, small chunks of data that they could quickly and rapidly analyze on their laptop and ultimately come up with innovations and drive better responses. And we thought that was very unique. When we look at this, I think it's tremendous how the community has responded to COVID. But one of the questions that I like to ask myself as, someone who tends to think of themselves as a data infrastructure person, who likes to collaborate with research scientists and clinicians, what's stopping us from doing this all of the time for all diseases? And there was this quote that, came out of Anish Chopra, former CTO for the Obama administration, that I thought was really, really exemplary, kind of really cut to the core of it. And what he said is, in the current state of COVID data sharing, we see exposed the failures of our public health infrastructure. We find ourselves with a $30 billion plus investment in EHR records, but health agencies aren't getting enough data to do an effective job. And when we talk with our customers, we see that this rings true. This isn't a failure, but there's I think, a very clear call to action for us to do a lot more to take our data, to make it findable, shareable, to make it easy to process with machine learning techniques, and to ultimately take that infrastructure and make it something that everyone in the community can go ahead and build on and contribute to, so that when the next pandemic, or when we're looking at diseases that we all as individuals care deeply about, we can make more progress on that data more rapidly. So ultimately for us, when we kind of, break this down, what we see is really three main fundamental challenges. One, the data is siloed and it's hard to integrate. We kind of come back to that quote about electronic health records. It's interesting because in EHRs, we have a couple of well-defined standards. We have HL7, we have FHIR. But even then, a lot of organizations, when they want to start to tap into that health data, they find it's really challenging to get the data out. There's a lot of questions around interface engines. And, even then, those APIs are designed for interchange. They're not necessarily designed for analysis. When we then look at scaling our analyses up, what we believe is that a lot of the insight that will come forward is from looking at large populations and, trying to find the trends inside of that data. We know that machine learning models, machine learning algorithms perform better when they get larger and larger data sets. But a lot of the algorithms that we're used to working with are designed to work on small data sets, data sets that we might have seen in the past in a N of 300, a clinical trial with an N of 300. Not necessarily the population data sets now that will aggregate data from 1 million up to hundreds of millions of patients together. And finally, when we look at, taking the insights that we get and translating them into the clinic, into research, we find that reproducibility is a struggle. No matter what insights we gain from our analytics, unless we can go ahead and build them out in a reproducible way and come up with an interchange format, we can quickly share that with researchers and clinicians, then ultimately, it's hard for the insights that we get to make their way into ultimately improving the lives of patients everywhere. Inside of Databricks, we have a couple of core pillars that we work on to try to address this. For us, obviously, we are an open source company as a core, and we strive, especially inside of the healthcare and life sciences team, to go ahead and build out best-of-breed technologies that make it especially rapid to go ahead and get data loaded up using open source technologies like Apache Spark and load it into open source stores like Delta Lake. We believe that this, when coupled with good data management principles, allow people to actually achieve the FAIR principles on petabyte-scale data sets. Where we then turn our focus to, and I'll talk to a couple of things that we're working on in this space, is we want to take the cutting edge algorithms that people might run on a single laptop or kind of on a heavy duty workstation, and we want to take them and scale them up to the scale of hundreds of thousands to millions to tens and hundreds of millions of patients. And finally, we want to go ahead and contribute this back to the community through open source software and enablement workshops that make this technology freely accessible to all people in the field, and to ensure that the people in the field are trained up and enabled to leverage these technologies. So that said, one thing that I do really want to highlight, this was something, that kind of hits on a number of those pillars. And, we were really thrilled by this coming out this week. For those of you, we had announced collaboration between Databricks and the Regeneron Genetics Center. We've been thrilled to work with them since October of last year. We announced this at the American Society for Human Genetics conference. We're really thrilled to have Jeff Reed on our panel today, who can speak to some of this work in more depth. But we have a project called Project Glow, which is an open source tool that allows people to load in data sets at the scale of millions of genomes and start to work with that data using Apache Spark. This week, we announced the 0.5 release of Glow, including a new method called Glow WGR, or Glow Whole Genome Regression. What this is a technology that is horizontally scalable in orders of magnitude faster than previous tools at sensitively detecting associations between genomic variants and diseases that we're interested in. We'll talk through this a bit more in the panel today, I'm sure, but we have a detailed blog on this, dbricks.co/glowgr, where we go into a lot of the details, a lot of the metrics, and a comparison to previous tooling. And we're tremendously excited by this, and we're tremendously excited to see this out in open source. Additionally, as we go into the back half of the year, we'll be having a very heavy focus on solution accelerators, which you can think of as kind of packaged how-tos with kind of exemplar notebooks that help to demonstrate how you can take some of these workflows that we've seen other customers be very successful with, that we think provide really cool new capabilities that can ultimately improve patient outcomes. So we're publishing a number of these. So we published a couple already today around building clinical data lakes, working with large-scale genomics. We have very extensive documentation around that. We've built out a number in the imaging space. But what we're very excited that we'll be focusing on in the back half of the year is a lot of the work that we're doing in the clinical and claims space. What we're starting to release is a lot of workflows and make it very simple and fast to take in data, whether it's coming from an HL7 feed, FHIR APIs, or claims formats like EDI and X12. We want to work with this both in historical batches as well as in a streaming setting where we have very rapid ingestion. And we want to start building out the common longitudinal queries on top of that. We have a couple of things that we're already running workshops on today in terms of building out and modeling cohorts of patients to get a better understanding of what factors in a patient population segment out how a patient will ultimately present with the disease, as well as using machine learning techniques that go ahead and build out better and more accurate models for how a disease progresses, built on top of longitudinal methods. This is all designed to be open source and integrates with best practice tools like MLflow to be fully reproducible. And we have a simple architecture up here that shows an example application that we built out with a customer who was building an application that would help them understand how patients were flowing through their clinic so that they could better match staffing levels to the flow of patients through their hospital as they were responding to COVID-19. With this, we were able to take very large streaming sources of HL7 messages, blend it in with staffing data, and ultimately push this into a database. So 5 minutes after a patient arrived in the hospital or moved within wards, they would show up in a dashboard that clinicians like hospitalists and in charge nurses could use to better manage resources inside of the hospital. So that said, we're really excited by the work that we've been doing, and we're really excited by the collaborations that we've had with the many customers that we have in the space. We strive to build out better infrastructure, but we thrive on the collaborations that we get from many of our customers who are pushing the bounds of precision medicine, clinical practice, and pharmaceutical research. We're proud to work with 8 of the top 10 pharma, 4 of the top 6 health insurers in the US, and multiple top 10 hospitals inside of the United States. That said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Julie Yu, who will give our keynote today. She is a general partner and the healthcare lead at Andreessen Horowitz. Julie, prior to joining Andreessen Horowitz, Julie was the co-founder, chief product officer, and board director at Kairos, a venture-backed health tech company recognized as a market leader in patient access. Julie led product management, engineering, sales, and marketing for the company and helped scale the business to reach 20 million patients and over 225,000 healthcare providers across the US. Previously, Julie was also VP of Product at Generation Health and was with the company from its inception through its acquisition at CVS Health. And Julie was a product manager at Gnome, the world's first whole genome sequencing service for private individuals. Julie's tech career began as an early member of the software engineering team at Endeca Technologies, which was acquired by Oracle. And Julie studied computer science and pre-medicine as an undergraduate at MIT, obtained an MS in genomics from Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology, and an MBA from MIT Sloan. Julie is a young global leader with the World Economic Forum, and has been recognized through numerous awards and honors from Becker's Hospital Review, Health Data Management, MedTech Boston, and Rock Health. So thank you very much for joining us today, Julie, and I'll go ahead and cede the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Let me go ahead and get set up here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my time and some thoughts in what is absolutely just an extraordinary moment in time on many levels. But I think in particular, as it pertains to healthcare, I truly believe that we are in this unlock moment, this moment where we will see the types of transformation that are really once in a generation, and certainly something that I believe is very rare for this industry, one that is it tends to be very ossified, tends to be very rigid, but we're just seeing fundamental transformation across the board. And I'll start by just stepping back. Actually, if I rewind the clock 7 months and think about some of the thoughts that I had on the state of the state just before the pandemic. Even at that point, there were a tremendous number of tailwinds that I was certainly very excited to track that were creating these very unique moments and opportunities for innovators and technologists and entrepreneurs in the healthcare space. And some of those tailwinds are the things that are listed here. That this concept of the unbundling of the hospital, this notion that we as patients had to historically go to these sort of very monolithic acute care facilities called hospitals to get any kind of care service. And that set of services was beginning to be deconstructed and made available to us in far more convenient and accessible ways. That is certainly inclusive of things like telehealth, things like virtual care, but also things like home-based healthcare, things like community-based healthcare. So those were some of the tailwinds that were already in play. Similarly, value-based care, something that we've been beating the drum of for nearly a decade at this point, this transition from a fee-for-service business model in healthcare to one in which we were making prospective payments that accounted for and gave incentives around maintaining wellness versus just reacting to when patients got sick. So again, something that had been in play for a couple of years prior to the current situation. Direct to consumer was a sort of a nascent area. It was actually one that I think a lot of traditional healthcare players were very skeptical of. Anything that sort of was able to generate revenue outside of the traditional reimbursement rails, so to speak, of payers and traditional health plans was seen as potentially an anathema to kind of the whole model of healthcare. But we were seeing the early stages of some traction of companies coming to market in that way. And then certainly on the supply chain side, I think there was already a recognition of the fragility of the supply chain of healthcare, whether it was in relation to medical equipment and PPE, as we saw play out obviously in the last few months, or even on the pharmaceutical supply chain side. There was already a recognition of a need for digitization, transparency, a need to just really fundamentally rebuild the end-to-end logistics layer of how healthcare is delivered. Now, that was the backdrop several months ago. Now, in light of the current pandemic and just all of this disruption that we're experiencing today, I truly believe that it's not just a matter of what's changing. It's really a matter of acceleration. The things that we thought would play out sometime in the next 10 years, I believe will happen far more quickly than that, really closer to 2 to 3 years. And we see all of that playing out right before our eyes today. One of the reasons for that is that we are just seeing fundamental dislocation on all sides of the market all at once. And this is truly unprecedented. It's fairly rare in any industry, let alone in healthcare, to see this level of dislocation, whether it's on the supply side with providers, as you can see here, legacy players, so namely, established provider organizations, hospitals, et cetera, are really being forced to shrink their services mix in a pretty dramatic way. And this is, I think, not unique to healthcare by any means. You see, restaurants shrinking their menus even to be able to streamline their supply chain, to streamline their operations, to just reduce risk around their business model. And, hospitals are really no different. They're really having to narrow down and focus on these essential services as they pertain to COVID. And what that's creating is this dynamic of really kind of leaving the ancillary services, other low acuity services that sort of surround those essential components really up for grabs. And so I think you're going to see a pretty significant shift in the competitive dynamics around service lines that perhaps hospitals had traditionally owned and thought they had some security around, but really are now up for grabs. And similarly, competition, whereas it used to be very localized, very geographically driven, all of a sudden with the advent of telehealth and virtual care, we're seeing that notion just being thrown out the window. Now people are going to have to redefine the way they think about their competitive set. They're truly going to have to think at a national scale, and services that are available 24/7 by multiple channels versus just the guys across the street who have a competing billboard on the highway. And finally, healthcare has always been one of the quote unquote most resilient industries in the sense that labor has always been growing. It's, even in past recessions, healthcare tended to be the only industry that continued to hire and grow its labor force during those periods of time. But, somewhat ironically and perhaps unfortunately, this pandemic has been one of the only moments when the healthcare labor force has actually shrunken and has actually decreased. And that is also creating a tremendous amount of dislocation there. On the flip side, on the demand side, we obviously have the very unfortunate situation of mass unemployment and therefore the loss of employer-sponsored health coverage. And that is going to create huge waves of just behavioral change in terms of where people flock for care. People are no longer able to mobilize, obviously, and the traditional healthcare system has really been designed with the assumption that, again, we as patients will travel to the doctor versus the other way around. And so those models, again, are just being completely flipped on their head. And I think with that, and perhaps this is the most dramatic aspect of on the consumer side, is I believe that we're going to see a window of time during which there will be significant shifting of relationships. Consumers are going to be willing to sever many of the longstanding relationships that they've had with their providers in the name of affordability and access. And we're already starting to see some of that play out. So as a consequence of these dramatic changes and dynamics, we will see a number of changes, I think, to the very structure of the industry. One example of that is this notion of sort of the patient journey. If you think about what the patient journey is and how it's defined today, what's been interesting historically about healthcare is that there have been distinct categories of companies that serve each of the different steps in that patient journey. So a coarse way to think about it is that there was a certain category of companies addressing the access problem. So at the top of the funnel, I'm a consumer who all of a sudden needs some kind of service. How do I navigate my options? How do I understand what's the most appropriate choice for me? There was a set of companies, including my own, Kairos, that focused on that portion of the funnel. And yet a second category of companies who are focused on the way that payments get generated in healthcare. So how does healthcare get paid for? Again, a completely different set of players, many of these multi-billion-dollar businesses in their own right, which was also then separate from the set of companies who were addressing the actual care delivery experience itself. What we have actually seen happening, again, because of some of these dynamics, is that this entire value chain is being completely rewired. The next generation of provider organizations are thinking about how do we actually own the end-to-end patient experience, so access, payments, and actual delivery, all in one single business model. And the thing that we're actually going to compromise on is not trying to be a one-size-fits-all business model for everyone, but rather taking very specific segments of the patient population, whether it be defined by demographic, whether it be defined by condition, and really focusing on being best in class for those populations. So some examples here, we are investors in a company called Omada, which focuses on sort of chronic disease patient populations and has built a very purpose-built care model for those patients. Similarly, there's a company called TIA, who is doing this for the end-to-end women's health journey. So I think we will start to see more of these sort of focused models that, again, are taking on the end-to-end care journey, but being very, very deliberate about which patient populations they're targeting. Related to that, and something that Frank already alluded to, is this concept that because of this novel set of providers that are now coming onto the market, the center of gravity of data is absolutely shifting. All of the dialogue to date around data storage, data aggregation, data interoperability has been hyper-focused on traditional EHRs and those that especially sit in sort of traditional hospital-based settings. But my belief is that we are now at this tipping point where the value of the data outside of the EHR is going to be far more valuable than that within it. And it's not just more value, it's really the resolution of that data, the granularity of that data, the longitudinal nature of that data. Companies like Omada, the nature of the data that they generate is far more comprehensive than what you would see in the traditional, highly transactional oriented, highly encounter based, and highly billing oriented EHR systems that we've seen historically. So this is certainly, one of the major shifts that we see occurring as well. Now all of that, hopefully is sufficient to, get you all excited about the tremendous opportunities there are out there for innovation and transformation. But, for those of us who have been in the healthcare space for a while, we know that sometimes it's the case, unfortunately, that, big and transformative things don't happen in healthcare unless there is a top-down mandate. And whereas I think about regulation as a barrier to innovation, I believe that if you actually look at the data, so to speak, regulation actually should be very much viewed as a catalyst. When you look at all of the major healthcare platform companies that have been built over the last several decades, most if not all can be really tied back to some singular regulatory driver that served to both create that category, but also establish many iconic companies in those categories. And that is no different today, where, as you can see here on the right-hand side, there are, again, a number of areas of the market where regulation has been laid out, and the confluence of the tailwinds that we described earlier are also playing out in such a way that we will see some new categories being created with some iconic companies within them. So hopefully that has convinced you that there is a very fascinating backdrop and just a really unique moment in time in healthcare that we have as innovators in this space to think about building companies, to think about transforming existing businesses. I wanted to now share some of my thoughts on, what are some of the grand challenges for organizations like the ones that you all represent, who think of themselves as data-driven or data foundation-based businesses and companies, to go after in this market. And before I do that, let's just step back for a second and remind ourselves, why we're doing this. And, really the holy grail is to get at this equation of how do we reduce the fundamental cost of care delivery without sacrificing quality? How do we just increase the yield that we get from this overall engine? And this is actually, I would say, core to the thesis of our firm at Andreessen Horowitz is, how do we think about moving the mindset, the fundamental mindset that we have within healthcare, from one of intuition. We rely very heavily today on intuition, on judgment, on sort of individual knowledge, to one in which we're taking much more of an engineering-based approach, where we are being much more deliberate about how we design systems and processes, how we can create reusable components that will help us scale, and also leverage learnings. How do we create a system that is continuously learning from all of the micro experiments that are happening across all of these data sets every single day, but are not able to be leveraged. So with that, I'll go into one of the first areas, and this is a pretty fundamental opportunity, I think, to impact this space. We need a fundamentally new operating system for care delivery, full stop. If you think about all of the transformation that I just described with regards to business model of healthcare, operating models of healthcare, even the geographic constraints of healthcare, we are relying on systems that were designed decades ago to be able to execute on that, and that's just not going to work, and it's already showing signs of not working. And so I believe that there's truly an opportunity now for the next generations of platforms to be built that are oriented around these fundamentally different ways of doing business. Systems that do contemplate value-based care. So again, moving away from the notion of the purpose of the medical record being to generate a claim that then gets submitted for reimbursement from a payer, to one in which it is truly the narrative of the patient, and with all of the color commentary around each of that patient's journey steps. combined with this notion of virtual native care. Many of the systems that exist today literally broke under the pressure of the vast increase in televisits and other digital type communications that we had to implement nearly overnight as COVID was hitting. And I think the new operating systems of the future within care delivery fundamentally need to be oriented around value-based business models and able to contemplate a truly virtual native care delivery model. So that's one opportunity. Very closely related to that, and this is again something that was mentioned earlier, is both a product opportunity, but I also think a fundamental paradigm shift where if you think about the moment that I book an appointment with a doctor to the time that I leave that doctor's appointment, so much of that time is actually spent simply collecting data. How many call center agents are there in the industry today whose full-time job it is to make outbound calls to patients before their appointment to collect information about me, to collect my demographics, to collect my insurance, to ask about my prior existing provider relationships, to then call and fax for retrieving the medical records from my previous providers. Imagine a world in which that data was available in real time in a liquid form, semantically organized, and systematically able to not just provide data about me, but also the benchmark population, so we can really shift the doctor's job from one of data collection to one of true care delivery. I mean, it's as simple as it seems. It's just not the case that we're enabling our providers to practice in that way today. So it's really this concept of, how do we not have to register a patient, but really just look them up. And as alluded to earlier, I think this is not just a huge opportunity for the care delivery side of the market, but really the clinical research side as well, and being able to do clinical trials and clinical research at population scale, I think is the huge opportunity around this concept. And then finally, this is one that's near and dear to my heart based on the work that I did at my previous company, but supply-demand matching has to be fundamentally redefined in terms of how we think about that across our healthcare system. This notion of, quote unquote, care traffic control, has to, it just requires a fundamentally different set of competencies to coordinate care in real time across networks that are not just local anymore, but really national. And not just national, but also across many different types of providers. I think the very definition of what is a provider is also changing extremely rapidly. It's not just physicians, it's not just nurses, it's also social workers, it's also dietitians and nutritionists, folks associated with home care. And therefore, I think this is a use case and a set of applications that is absolutely primed for, again, data and analytics-oriented companies to establish sort of the new routing and load balancing protocols for the future of care delivery. So with that, again, I just think that, and especially having been in the healthcare space for as long as I have, it's really rare that moments like this come along, and things that I certainly thought were either not possible at all or that would take many, many years to play out, we see every single day playing out in front of our eyes across the entire industry. And I could not be more optimistic and more excited about what the next 10 years holds as far as this opportunity to really both transform the existing incumbents within our industry, but also create new opportunities for new entrants to scale in just ways that we haven't seen before in this market. And I'll end with the words of the founder of our firm, Mark Andreessen, who wrote a piece a few weeks ago called "It's Time to Build." I think there is no industry to which this is more pertinent and more relevant and more needed and more urgent than healthcare and the markets that we all are working in. So I hope that this was a source of inspiration to all of you who are innovating in the space and you're really looking to use data-driven approaches and tech-based approaches to bring down the cost of care, improve the outcomes and the quality of care, but also just make for that patient experience that we as consumers all wish we had.
Excellent. Thank you very much for for joining us and talking through. I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and I did just want to take a second before we roll into the panel to ask one question that came in from the audience. Specifically, we had a question I thought tied in very nicely to a few of the trends that you spoke to around value-based care kind of new data reporting platforms, and the pressures on healthcare costs, especially as many people have lost employee-sponsored or employer-sponsored healthcare. They're asking, with changes in regulation, do you see value in better reporting, better reporting applications that give more insight, more transparency into the pricing and the cost of various different healthcare services? And they're specifically asking this in the context of self-reporting around the cost of procedures, overnight stays, and et cetera. Would love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a very meaty topic, and it's obviously timely in terms of some of the actual policies that are being sort of negotiated as we speak. But absolutely, price transparency. It's such a interesting topic in that the very definition of price is controversial in healthcare, right? The billed amount, the amount that a provider bills to an insurance company, is very distinct from the contracted rate that a provider is sort of guaranteed to get paid for, which is distinct from the out-of-pocket costs of a certain procedure or set of services that a patient might receive if they're uninsured. And so I think that in and of itself is a data problem, right? At the end of the day, there are multiple versions of quote-unquote price that today there's really no systematic means for us to get access to. There was a great quote in the recent, regulation case. The AHA, the American Hospital Association, was suing the government for this price transparency bill that's been put on the table. And the quote was, hospitals sort of making the case that this was an impossible task, that in order to actually manage and present all this data, you would need a spreadsheet with 100,000 columns in it to present that information. And, that's just a testament to the fact that we're probably, first of all, fundamentally thinking about the problem the wrong way, but also that this is absolutely a problem that is very, conducive to the application of tech and data. So I think that is certainly, one broad statement. I would say the other thing is that I do think with the advent of, so much disruption on the insurance coverage side, that there will be a sort of an influx of options for like sort of alternatives to employer-sponsored insurance that patients will have to shop for on their own as consumers. And in those situations, that is only possible with price transparency. And so you probably saw a few of the logos on my slide there in the transparency box, but there are some companies whose sole business model is essentially to price products and services and procedures in a transparent way, because patients are being sort of left to their own devices to have to figure out how to get access to affordable services. So this, I think, will be a huge dimension of how healthcare gets transformed in the next few years.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I like to think, coming from genomics, we can at the very least solve the 100,000 column wide spreadsheet issue.
Exactly.
We deal with a lot of that, but thank you very much for giving your perspective on that, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, pleasure was ours. Great. Well, we'll go ahead and transition over into our panel. So I'll go ahead and just really quick go through and into our panel members before we dive on in. Today we'd like to welcome 4 people. So we'll have Dr. Benu Matthew from Mercy. Dr. Matthew is an adult internal medicine hospitalist physician practicing at Mercy Hospital St. Louis since 2007. He also serves as the Vice President of Medical Intelligence and Analytics, where he leads a team of highly talented individuals who possess skills and knowledge in the key domains of clinical practice, Epic backend, database architecture, machine learning, and predictive analytics. And his team are passionate about gathering nuggets of insight from millions of rows of data that enable providers to make better decisions about the care of the patients that they work with. We are also joined by Jeff Reed. Jeff Reed is the head of genome informatics at the Regeneron Genetics Center, where he leads a team developing and applying novel large-scale computational analysis tools, systems, and methods to produce and analyze large genomic data sets with the goal of making precision medicine a reality. We also are joined by Dr. Joanne Hackett. Dr. Joanne Hackett leads the healthcare practice at Izzy Capital, where she works with, incubates, and grows the next generation of world-leading innovators. Professor Hackett is a clinical and academic, entrepreneur, investor, and a strategic creative visionary with global experience spanning successful startups to Fortune 500 companies. Aside from a curious passion for life and positivity, Joanne is known for building innovation, driving personalized medicine, and leading through fast-paced, complex, changing ecosystems and integrations. And then finally, we'd like to welcome Sanji Fernando from Optum. Sanji Fernando is a senior vice president at Optum, where he leads the artificial intelligence and analytics platform team for Optum Enterprise Analytics. Previously, Sanjay was a vice president at Optum Labs, where he led the Optum Labs Center for Applied Data Science. The CADS team applied breakthroughs in AI and machine learning to solve complex healthcare challenges for United Healthcare groups, including things such as streamlining administrative processes and revenue cycle management, and developing graph analytics tools to support provider network design, among other areas. So thank you very much, panelists, for joining us today. It's a distinct pleasure to have you on. To go ahead and open up, obviously we touched on COVID at the start. But, I'd love to hear about the dramatic impact that COVID has had in your space. So, let's rewind back to January of this year. When you looked at this, what role did data and AI play inside of your organization? What were you focused on? How did it change? And what have you learned from going through this process where many of us have kind of dramatically reprioritized things, moved a bunch of projects forward, and, kind of learned as we went? So maybe Dr. Banu, would you mind starting us off from the Mercy side?
Absolutely, thank you. COVID did definitely bring a lot of challenges for us at totally unprecedented times, and bringing together real-time data along with batch processing data in our systems has always been something that we've been working on, but it accelerated that need to have relevant information accessible to our clinicians as well as executives to make decisions on surge planning or capacity planning across the system. As we thought about the delivery of care way back in October 2015, Mercy led the country and built one of the world's finest facility of its kind in terms of virtual medicine and telemedicine and telehealth. And we were able to really leverage a lot of that capability from delivering not just digital care, but virtual and physical care for the patient. And so being able to refine the environments through which patients delivered and received care was paramount. So, regardless if they were, curious about symptoms related to COVID or were exposed to somebody who had COVID, making sure that access to care was done in a seamless and frictionless manner for the patient. So really brought together a lot of those previous capabilities that we had, optimal collaboration amongst different clinicians, both internal and external in our systems, and be able to deliver that care for our patients.
Excellent. That makes perfect sense. Sanjay, I don't know if you have audio now.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, excellent. I'm kind of curious, I think, Optum winds up being in a very interesting setting where you kind of have, really dramatic national visibility. I'm kind of curious, did you see similar trends or, how did that have impact on your side?
Yeah, so if I think about where we were at in January with regard to our priorities and our focus, and I speak for myself personally, not for the whole organization, my focus had been to look at those administrative processes as we always have and understand how we can apply the latest breakthroughs in AI, in document processing, in image processing to address things like reimbursement, claims processing. And as COVID hit, what we've seen is that some of the things are unchanging. We're not moving away from doing those things better and faster and cheaper, but it's afforded us this great opportunity where the healthcare system's always been running full steam ahead, and probably sadly or scarily with the COVID crisis, not only do we see a tremendous influx in COVID-related cases, but we saw this dramatic fall in the utilization of other services, which we all should be very concerned about. But it's also given us a window to say, hey, how do we sit down and get ready for when those services are going to pick back up? How do we enable ourselves to do that better, faster, to partner with the clinicians and subject matter experts that we're going, 120 miles an hour every day to support the ongoing volume of care we had to support. There's now this moment of pause, and we could sit down with them. We could say, hey, what can we do differently? What we could do safely and put back into production to help us address this volume that we expect will come back in some manner or form. And so that's been exciting. I'll give you a real example. It's like we were working arduously to align on CCDs as a common way to share EHR information. And with the crisis, in part to address what we didn't know about COVID, but also in part because we had this sort of pause in volume, we accelerated our use of CCDs across a number of clinical delivery organizations that we own and operate today. And that kind of focus in that moment where we can just, in light of this terrible crisis, really force ourselves to rethink problems. We're starting to do that, and that's pretty exciting.
No, that makes a ton of sense. That makes a ton of sense. And, I guess, Joanne, obviously being in the UK, the UK and the US had somewhat different, somewhat similar responses. Would you mind kind of sharing what you saw in your time?
Yeah, sure. So if we rewind back to January, I was wearing a very different hat then. So many of you probably recognize me from Genomics England. Obviously, this is where my relationship with Databricks was first born. So I was the Chief Commercial Officer at Genomics England for the past 3 years and left at the end of March. So January was a very different time for me, very different hat on. But I will speak more from the Genomics England perspective in the sense that what we actually had been doing for the past 3 years was really building that foundation. And Julie highlighted it beautifully. You want to make sure that when someone walks into a clinic or a hospital or a dental surgery or anywhere, that someone knows more about them than they almost know about themselves. No one wants to be faffing about trying to get different sorts of information. And Genomics England was trying to lay the foundation to make sure that any information that was collected clinically, as well as genomically, was put together in a database so that was easily accessible so that an individual journey could actually be documented. And that data could then be shared with researchers and industry, if they had the right credentials, of course, to be able to do further research. And it wasn't just research for the sake of research, but it was to build better systems, to be smarter, to be able to try to move healthcare from us treating sick people to preventing them from getting sick and monitoring them. So I think one of the things that I've noticed since January, and not even just in the genomic space or in the healthcare space as a whole, is more people are focusing on how do we collect data. In the UK, we're always talking about the great data that we have in the NHS, and it's worth cajillions and all these big fancy numbers that we throw around. It's actually not worth anything if people aren't using it. And people aren't using it because it's not the right type of data or it's not accessible. So I think what I've seen tremendous shift on, even in the past 6 months, has been that mind shift on why do we think all this data that we have is useful if we're not opening it up or if we're not collecting it correctly to begin with, and really kind of shifting that mindset so that it's not just about what I can collect and store, but how can I actually make that accessible? And I think for me personally, the biggest success has been all of a sudden we're no longer talking about the patient or how this is that group of patients. All of us were affected and still are being affected by COVID. Any of us could get sick at any moment in time. This has no barriers. So we're used to grouping patients or thinking we need to get an opinion of a patient. We're all patients in this. So how do we start taking that really quite strange dynamic that we've put around patients and thinking of it as citizens, and it's a citizen-driven approach. When you go into for a dental cleaning, it's the exact same thing. You're a patient, if you want to call them that. So what I've been delighted on is that all of a sudden, we're all in the same playing field, and having that mindset that the data is owned by the individual, and the individual can collect it, collate it, share it, and be able to use it and spread it around as much or as little as they want, has been a real delight for me.
No, that makes perfect sense. And, I think one of the, it's great, we have, have Jeff on the panel. Jeff, in your role at the RGC, you do a lot of work of blending data across multiple different hospitals, multiple different coding systems, et cetera. And, obviously you work very closely with another genomics project in the UK Biobank, on their large-scale exome sequencing. They've recently released a lot of COVID-related data. What would you have to add to this? And, kind of how has your perspective changed the last few months?
So the thing I would echo is the comment that Joanne made about kind of building a foundation. I would say for us, If you look at the history of our infectious disease antibody development platform that we use to great effect in Ebola, right, in January, we actually were starting our SARS-CoV-2 antibody program, because this is a platform that we had been building to prepare for exactly this kind of disaster, to try to be able to create a passive vaccine that could be deployed very rapidly for an outbreak of a serious infectious disease. On the RGC side, it's sort of similar. We built out these very large data sets and built really great partnerships like with UK Biobank, where, you know, we have so many people, for example, in the Geisinger health system already sequenced, and we have so much medical record data on these people that as we are accruing additional COVID data, as with UK Biobank, there's now an opportunity to leverage the data that we have, the relationships we have, to try to bring this data together and integrate it. And then I would say the only other big difference is, you know, we did change our priorities, or let's say kind of reorganize our priorities a little bit in terms of who we were looking to partner with, because, you know, we did take as a priority the idea that if we could find partners who could really provide data that could speak to COVID questions, that's something that was uniquely interesting. So we've sort of shifted a little bit of our focus, but primarily this has been a story for us anyway, of just really executing on the plans that we have kind of built all along for trying to rapidly respond to disease and create solutions for serious problems.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. And, you know, one of the things that I think is, you know, really interesting is the big theme that came out across every single question or every single answer you all had. And we've actually had a number of these kind of questions along this line trickle in on the QA. But a big thing that kept on emerging is a need for better interoperability. You know, whether it's internally, and, you know, I know, Benu, you know, you spend a lot of time in your job thinking about how does data flow internally? How do we take data that's accessible in these raw systems and make it accessible to the clinicians, to the administrators who are making decisions? Sanji, obviously, you shared about your experience with, you know, CCDs and other internal data sharing methods. And, you know, Jeff and Joanne, you know, you both spoke heavily about your experiences in terms of federating data in and federating it out. One of the questions that we did one of the things that we did have come up is, you know, I'd love to hear, you know, what do you see as like some of the barriers that we have that are causing us to struggle today? One of our Q&A questions actually came in and talked about data anonymization. You know, do we see that as an issue that is limiting data sharing today? And, you know, I know, you know, Jeff, you'll probably have, you know, a fair amount of points of view on that. But I'd love to hear, you know, what can we do to improve data sharing internally, and what can we do to be, you know, good stewards of public trust? Maybe Sanji, you know, since you were talking about some of the efforts that you had internally, let's go ahead and start with you, and I'd love to kind of get the panel's perspective on this.
Yeah, you know, it's been a challenge, as I'm sure all the panelists and the many on the call are aware of, on achieving sort of seamless interoperability across the healthcare system. In part, there are very good reasons, you know, data privacy, being good stewards of data, recognizing that HIPAA provides us a great deal of protection as individuals in the privacy of our healthcare data. But I also think it's almost reflective of our multifaceted U.S. healthcare system. And I don't mean to be U.S.-centric, where we have providers, payers, governments all working in concert to deliver care, to ensure great outcomes. Maybe it doesn't work as well as we hope at times. I think that's fair to say, but it doesn't mean that it can't work better. And I think the key to interoperability is going to bring those governmental entities, the patients themselves, the providers, the payers together. You know, it might start at the federal level with ONC and things like that, but I think everyone has to agree that they're going to work together. And I think people are, you know, starting with the EMR vendors, but processors and platforms like ourselves and others are all starting to have that conversation. It won't happen overnight. But we're all recognizing the importance of that interoperability. And part of it is also recognition that we have a very heterogeneous system. You know, some providers are smaller and their health IT investments are going to be different than those at larger scale. And so making sure everyone comes along this journey is going to be our challenge, but also our opportunity.
Makes perfect sense. And, you know, I think especially the point around the EHR, you know, around kind of our system of record holds holds a great point. And, Dr. Banu, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. You probably know by and far the most about EHR implementations, especially at large providers of any of us that are at Spark Summit this week. So I'd love to kind of hear a bit about your experiences there, how you've seen this evolve, and what do you think we could be doing better?
So at Mercy, we were really fortunate that more than 10 years ago, we've standardized our EMR system across 4 states in the Midwest and 40 plus hospitals. And we were able to capture a lot of that standardized data. But I think, a lot of the other systems in our geographies and even other places, as they came onto the EMR platform a little later, you start introducing custom site-specific workflows that make interoperability a little bit more challenging. Are technical, but I would say that I think some challenges are human at the end of the day, because COVID really raised a flag and need for us to come to the battle all together, and we did. And sometimes those altruistic lines can get faded as time goes by, right? As data sharing becomes more and use cases become more crystallized, it can become a challenge. So sometimes challenges are human. And I think, the business aspect of it, the competitive edge and advantage side of it starts playing a role sometimes. So overall, I would say that there's been some tremendous collaboration in all the states that we serve with across different health systems. And we gathered a lot of insights together that has really helped us think through the longitudinal care of this patient, whether they're receiving care in our system or in a neighboring hospital.
That makes a ton of sense. And I'm actually kind of curious on that last point. Like, have there been best practices that you've seen that have really facilitated those sorts of collaborations across the healthcare value chain?
I think it's coming together now. I think we're still early on in really establishing a good continuum of care perspective that we can really understand the picture of that patient. But I would say it's still being gathered.
Makes sense. And one thing I'd say, maybe just turning over to Jeff for a sec. Jeff, one of the things that I think is kind of very interesting about your group and how many different healthcare ecosystems your team works across. On a single day, you may be dealing with UK Biobank data that has survey data, self-reported data from other health systems. You may be dealing with data that's coming in from an EHR at one of the hospital systems that you collaborate with. And just earlier this week, we talked about the challenge of harmonizing data across these different feeds and dealing with, one of the human factors that I think, Banu and Sanju would both feel strongly about, which is that all of our providers actually describe phenotypes differently. What are your thoughts in the space, and especially on your side, how do you balance kind of working with all of these data sets in an anonymized fashion?
So I think the thing that is most relevant to me is the idea that you are not going to solve this data integration problem or this data harmonization problem with kind of one magic bullet. And the analogy that I would make is, like most people, I weigh probably X pounds more than I should weigh, right? And I probably don't get as much sleep as I should get. And the way to fix that is to be more disciplined in going to bed at the right time and not eat late in the day and go to the gym all the time. And people are always looking for this kind of magic bullet for losing weight, just like I wish there was a magic bullet for integrating data, particularly complicated data like health data, but that's just not how it works. It's a maintenance process. It is a fundamentally difficult to commit to long-term commitment that's relatively unsexy, but incredibly important, of getting up every day and going to the gym every day, whether you feel like it or not. And so this is like going and doing the day-to-day blocking and tackling, getting a data set, understanding a data set, figuring out what the vagaries of that data set are, then figuring out how to integrate it with the other data sets you have. Physicians, let's say, use the EMR differently, right? Some physicians will code things in one way and some physicians will code things in another way. I have a great anecdote where I saw my doctor and I gave him my opinion on how he should code a particular thing. Frankly, he was coding it wrong. And he was not that interested in my opinion. He was wanting to use the code that was the colloquial code that he would use for this particular thing. And, it wasn't a matter of what is the right thing to do in terms of the data. It was a matter of how does this person use that as a tool in their delivery of care. We're not going to change the way everybody works heterogeneously, so we have to just do that really unsexy slogging through hard work. But the payoff, if you go to the gym a lot, is you feel better, you're healthier, you live longer. The same thing here. People will feel better, we will make them healthy, and they will live longer if we do this hard work of really integrating the data on a blocking and tackling day-to-day basis.
Makes perfect sense. And, as a Bay Area resident who doesn't sleep enough, I try to trade off by getting up early to run uphill. It's, worth 5 cups of coffee. I'm not sure if the reduced sleep over time has a negative impact, but it is what it is. Actually, I'd love to, just kind of riffing off the coding side for a second. Sanji, I know, a ton of the work that your team does is spent using NLP to go ahead and resolve coding errors and to clarify coding. Would you mind kind of commenting on that real quick? And, how much of this you see as an opportunity for, something that we can try to solve, try to clean up from a computational side versus, how does that all kind of come together?
It's a great question. It is a tough one. If I riff of what Jeff said, when I think about interoperability and consistency in practice and things like that, and how we capture coding or any sort of the reimbursement cycle, there may not be a finish line here. Medical practice is constantly changing. Our approach to reimbursement needs to change and evolve as our economy changes, as new regulations change. And so this commitment to interoperability is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. We're going to have to get up every morning and make sure things are lined up the right way. And we're probably going to need an ensemble of ways to do that, whether it be common practices and interfaces, built off of, I think, a lot of great energy and thoughtfulness has gone into FHIR, and we're seeing more coalesce around that. But today we use techniques like neural machine translation, document classification using deep learning on, sadly, medical records that we receive via fax, that we need to sort of decompose with optical character recognition, and then we're able to identify and utilize that information to get to certain answers. In other cases, we need to actually understand the structure of that and highlight portions of that text. Other times we could classify the whole document, and then ideally we get it electronically and we'd be able to more deterministically know exactly what we want out of the document. And I think we're going to live with that for a little while, a little while being like, 3, 5, 7 years. But I think recognizing there's a basket of things we could do to get value out of that information is going to be really important, and hopefully accessible to more people, and recognize that we may not need as much manual work or rework to correct things through the process.
Makes sense. And, Joanne, I think you have a very interesting perspective on this. Obviously, many of us kind of come from the U.S. system where there's a very large degree of heterogeneity, but you spent a lot of your career, working inside the Canadian and then, now the UK health system, and especially at, Genomics England, you collaborated heavily with the NHS. Obviously when in kind of a more consolidated care system, how does that change things? And, what have been your lessons learned on that side?
Yeah, so I think there is obviously very big differences when you've got a closed loop healthcare system. And I guess you do see that in pockets in America, because a lot of the different UPMC, for example, in various places like that, it is a closed loop. But I think the biggest difference is the transparency. So one of the things that Genomics England did very well, very early on, was engage, again, the patient, known as participants as part of the Genomics England 100,000 Genomes project. And these participants were told very upfront what was to be expected, what was to not be expected, because genomics is not a silver bullet. And in addition to that, they consented for two things, research and recontact. And by doing that, they also had the right to know who was using their data and how it was being used. So there has to be a public registry of the data that's actually being collected of them and how it's actually being used and by who. And it is onerous, and this kind of is going back to your gym analogy. But by putting those foundations in place at the beginning, you streamline the rest of it. And yes, there are always going to be, challenges around, should it be easier to access the data or in different formats and whatnot? Putting all of that aside, it fundamentally comes back to each and every one of us. If we don't feel as though we want to share our data or allow someone to access it, we won't do anything with it. So the power is really coming back to the citizen. And also, I think what has been a big difference in the UK healthcare system is that individuals here believe in one thing and one thing only, and it's the NHS. It is religion in the UK. And you put something into that, even if you don't get something back yourself. So a genomics program is a very good example of that. You may not get a diagnosis, but your data federated with someone else's data and someone else's data might actually provide insights. And I think, but if people feel that they're contributing something for either the greater good or potentially for themselves, that's usually where that trade-off comes from. And there was a beautiful report several years ago by our then Chief Medical Officer, who was Dame Sally Davis. And she said each individual who is in the healthcare system, which effectively is all of us, should be thought of as a research subject. Why can't we use each of one of these people, where we're all these people, as research subjects? We all carry cell phones. Can we not do something with that data? And various things like that. But underpinning all of that is the concept of the trade-off. So we all log into websites. If we want to go shopping, we see things pop up. If it's blocking the image of the piece of clothing that we're trying to buy, we click the I accept button, whatever it even means. But we've made that conscious trade-off. I want to see an image, or I want to make a transaction, and therefore I am trading something for that. It's not too different when it comes to healthcare. How could I possibly expect a doctor to treat me accordingly if I'm not willing to share information? So it comes back in a sense to your gym analogy that we've been using all along, but also in the sense that there is no silver bullet. So I can demand high quality healthcare, but I have to trade something for that. And until I feel safe that all the conditions that I want satisfied are there, I won't make that trade-off. So we need to get better at allowing standards to be standardized, I guess. And in addition to that, we have to learn from different regulations and embed them. And I think the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, the GA for GH, are doing fantastic work in this. And I think it's by having a set of tools and standards that are going to be rolled out that gives citizens the confidence that they want to make that trade-off. And I think what I'm seeing now with my other hat on, my IZY hat, these really interesting companies that are coming out and realizing that they don't have to be an end-to-end provider, but if they can have a tool in some of these different systems to either e-consent or unlock the power of your iPhone data or something like that, how can that all come together in this nice little package to really empower the citizen? So I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, very much so agreed. And, I think especially your call out on kind of the open community around this is very important. I totally agree with you on the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Been engaged with them since 2014, and in 2016 chaired up one of their workflow standardization groups. And, I think the power of the community coming together, agreeing on standards, disagreeing sometimes on standards, but working together to go ahead and build those and collaborate on building the future is really critically important. I think you also have a very interesting position in this, with where you've kind of sat in the space of bringing organizations to collaborate together. What have you seen has really moved the needle in that perspective? Has it been technology, communication, a blend of them all? What would you say have been best practices in your experience?
Yeah, so I think it always comes down to being transparent. And I think that the things that were very fundamentally obvious, especially for the individuals who were obviously donating their data to Genomics England to be a custodian. The very transparent thing was, there is a trade-off. This is what you are giving to us, and this is what we are giving you in return, and this is what we are not giving you, and this is what you are not giving us. So the transparency issue was very, very strong. But in addition to that, there are obviously, as you have highlighted, many other things that have to happen around the periphery. Again, collecting the data, absolutely no use if you don't have a place to store it, if you don't have a place to access it once it's been stored, you don't have a place to actually look at it, make insights, allow industry to make insights, allow academia to make insights. So there has to be various different mechanisms. There's about 3,000 academics globally that access the Genomics England database. There are hundreds of pharma companies that do that. This has to be a global endeavor. And I think, for the individuals who are doing this and looking at it on a much larger scale, Genomics England is obviously only in the UK. The power of actually pulling together clinical data and genomic data, that the dream would clearly be to have the two of them together, but pulling together that clinical data globally and having federated insights, it has to be something that is not owned by one institution. And the minute individuals take a step back and say, right, I can't do all of this myself, that's when magic happens. And that's what we're seeing now in our pandemic, is that we realize very quickly the limitations of what we can actually achieve. So taking a step back, it's much better and much more satisfying to see something progress than to try to own it yourself and actually take 5 years to achieve the same thing that a little group of people can do in a matter of days. So it's transparency and collaboration have to be the key.
No, it makes perfect sense. And, Jeff, I'll go ahead and kind of steer this a bit towards you. I think, obviously you collaborate extensively at the RGC out with other groups, but, between our two groups, we've been really fortunate to collaborate the last few months around Project Glow. And, it's very unusual. It's kind of a new wave for someone inside of pharma to be going ahead and saying, hey, investing in open source software is critical for the future of our field. We need to come together as a community to build around this. So, what would you add to that? Kind of how do you see this evolving?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I guess the anecdote that I would point out is, when I was out there and met you guys, it seems like forever ago when people would actually meet in person and be on airplanes. But maybe a little more than a year ago, and I remember we were discussing, well, what could we do in open source? And it got very exciting to me because being, fundamentally a scientist and building all of my work on the work of others, as all scientists do, this felt like something that we could do, but I was frankly unsure, how this would work at the company. And so went back and actually engaged one of our key legal and IP collaborators within Regeneron to really think this through. And actually one of the big initiatives that I've been involved in internally is just really thinking through for the company, what does a formal pharma company open source policy look like? How do we, think about when things should be done in open source and what is our commitment there? So it ended up being a lot more administrative work than I really wanted to take on. But actually, it ended up landing in such a great place with Glow, where people within the analytical genetics team, Jonathan Marchini and Joel Mbachu, came up in collaboration with people on my team, Evan Maxwell and Leland Barnard and Lucas Habegger. This idea of really thinking about doing regression in a different way that was essentially distributable and scalable, and that fundamentally then being able to collaborate with you guys. Was the secret sauce in my mind that then led us to really be able to distribute this and make it truly optimal. And so, to my mind, this is absolutely the future of genetics and genomics and health. And as Joanne says, we really have to get patients and participants in studies kind of thinking in the same way. But the thing that was very heartening to me was I saw a study, I believe this was in UK Biobank, but I'm not remembering the data set, where the number one concern was not data security. I know there were questions about anonymization and whatnot. The number one concern was, would my data be used, right? People desperately want to help, right? It is the most empowering and honestly the most positive and optimistic thing to listen to these people talk about, hey, I want to give you my data because I think if it helps somebody, then that's good for them and that's good for me. And so we worry a lot more, frankly, about making sure that we are respecting that contribution and maximally utilizing the data to try to help people than we get obsessed with, whatever the vagaries of some problem relating to sharing or whatever. Of course, data security and compliance are like table stakes to do any of this, but once that's handled, you really should focus on making sure that the data is used effectively, because that's what people really are looking for when they're contributing data to these studies.
Makes perfect sense. And Banu, I see you nodding very enthusiastically. Obviously, coming from the clinical side, coming from that that real setting where you're taking this data and translating it into care, I'm sure you have a very strong viewpoint, not just on data sharing overall, but really on that kind of translational, that last mile to actually get this in the hands of a clinician and have it have a meaningful impact on patient care. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
No, absolutely. Our goal is to do everything we can to make sure that the patient receives the most optimal care in the right setting at the right time. And I think, right from patients having symptoms of presumed COVID and getting to our digital screener on our website to go through a few questions and then connecting with the virtual care nurse who can further handle the triage of the right environment, whether if it's with the virtual physician or one of our physicians at the ambulatory care centers or direct them to the ER if it's necessary. Our goal has always been to make sure that we are able to give that experience, the care experience in the most seamless, frictionless way as possible. So a lot of things have I must say, have come together, and as someone mentioned previously, spike in video visits to enable that and make that happen. But again, going back to how do we make sure that for the patient, not every patient needs to be admitted to the hospital, right? Initially, when COVID started, I would say our threshold for getting people in was much lower. We really didn't understand enough about the disease, and every little symptom was COVID until proven otherwise, right? So, or people were admitted with really a very low threshold. But a lot has changed since the last few months. I would say that people are being triaged better, handled better, and the more optimal care environments are being set up for them as we go ahead. So, and continues to be in terms of what is the most optimal treatment. There are lots of patients, to our previous point, on have recovered and want to contribute and want to be donors with convalescent plasma treatments, etc., that have raised their hands and want to help others. So having that network of abilities to coordinate the care and make sure that, again, the right care is being delivered at the right time in the most convenient setting.
Did we lose Frank? I think maybe we lost Frank.
We might as well. It looks like we lost Frank, but while he's joining back in, I know one of the questions we wanted to get to, we're kind of towards the end of time, but as we look towards the future, I think it'd be great to hear kind of your vision or areas that you guys are most excited about, or where do you see the biggest opportunity? We talked a lot about, transparency, interoperability, how things have changed, but what's the opportunity look like? So maybe, Jeff, since you spoke up first, why don't you chime in?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we've been very excited about with the UK Biobank data is there are things that you can capture with essentially just self-reported data that are just simply not really captured in the healthcare record very effectively. So one example is we saw...
Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
So one of the really interesting things we saw in the biobank data was there's an association between this genetic variant that is known to be associated with dementia and Alzheimer's with the time to complete the questionnaire that people are asked to fill out with UK Biobank. And so just the idea that with meticulous collection of detailed data and things you wouldn't think of, like how long it takes somebody to answer the list of questions that you're asking them because you're trying to get information about their health, is in and of itself actually associated with the genetics that relates to their health. So the idea that there are these modalities of data that can be collected that are not the kinds of things that the healthcare system collects that are incredibly important in understanding biology and health, that I think is a really untapped place where there's a lot that can be done in terms of figuring out what data types to gather and how to gather.
And Sanji, you obviously are in a spot where you guys are collecting lots of different types of data. What are your thoughts on that? Bringing new data sources. How do you encourage folks to do it? Is that an area you guys are focused on as well?
Yeah, extremely so. And whether it's social determinants of care, understanding that patient better, as Julie highlighted, we've been even really excited by this. In light of this crisis, this explosion of our use of telemedicine services, and how can that data change the way we think about population health? Maybe, all of a sudden we're capturing at scale diagnostic interactions between a clinician and patient in a way, in an encounter setting that we've never had that kind of data capture for. And so what can we learn from those interactions? What can we learn from those types of new modalities of delivering care? The whole telemedicine explosion during this crisis has really opened, I think, many eyes to, should we be asking ourselves, what can we do more with wearables, with other ways to engage patients as well? And so I think with each one of those new engagement modalities becomes more data, more information as well that we can take advantage of. And so we're excited about that. I think we've got, like with many things, a few years ahead of us to bring that stuff together. But it is really encouraging.
All right, I have made it back. My apologies for having my internet fail. It is poor form to have your internet fail in the middle of a panel you're moderating, but we can't always choose what happens. So gotta be able to roll with it. But sorry, what was that?
I was just saying you missed the best part. Don't worry about it.
No worries. I'll catch the recording. So cool. I know we just have 5 minutes left, and obviously I missed the best part, as Jeff was saying. But I think just to go ahead and drop off, maybe for a last round of questions. I think many of us have kind of spoken about the work that we're doing today and the potential to see many of these data sets come together. Whether they're genomics data sets, EHR, clinical notes, coding data, images, etc., kind of accelerating out of the COVID times. What do you see as kind of the next use case you'll focus on? Maybe maybe real quick. Maybe Jeff. Let's start with you, and then we can kind of go back through and finish off there.
So one of the comments I made earlier, while you were missing the great part, was the idea of these other modalities of data, things like collecting metadata and using associations with metadata. I would say that one of the things that we're really looking to do is to get more into data sets and collaborations with entities where there's a collection of individuals that are coming together. So you see this often in rare disease, where they have rare disease groups that are coming together to try to cure a rare disease. And I think getting closer to the patient and closer to the participant, and kind of as much as possible interacting directly with them, not just to get additional data types, which can be really valuable, but also to be, frankly, building the kinds of case counts that you need to get the power to understand some of these sort of tough to crack diseases can be really important and valuable. And so just the idea of trying to get more direct relationships, I think is a place where genetics is really going, and particularly something we're thinking about. Although, of course, right now it's complicated because it's hard for two people to be in the same space together.
Yeah, and I know, Joanne, you've worked heavily in the rare disease space, and you're seeing a lot of new startup innovators. What do you see emerging? And probably we'll end with that as our last question, just with just a couple minutes.
Yeah, sure. So I'll be very brief, because for me, I have one dream. I don't want us to treat sick people. I want us to prevent them from getting ill. So all of this data that's being generated, fantastic. We're getting newer ways of collecting it, faster ways of federating it. But let's start finding those patterns and implementing them, and thinking about completely changing the way that we actually deliver healthcare. Let's find out what the symptoms are before someone gets sick, and let's treat them. And that's where healthcare is shifting in the next, hopefully, 3 to 5 years. And that's what excites me.
Yeah, and I know Sanji and Banu, both of your teams have done a fair amount of work in the predictive space for care. So I imagine that resonates quite closely with you all. But if you have anything to add, would love to take that as closing remarks. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so really understanding that longitudinal track with the patient and putting things into practice, like Joanne mentioned, there's lots of insights that are it's lost, right? So making sure that we can bring it back into effective point of care decision making, helping clinicians make better decisions and making use of all of these insights. So there is a human change management piece to this too, where we want people to trust and be able to interpret what the insights are showing them. But at the end of the day, absolutely need to put things into practice.
No, yeah, definitely makes sense. Definitely makes sense. Sanji?
I think I'll try to keep it quick. I think, when I look forward out, and I'm not a clinician, but I think about the staggering scale of the amount of data we're collecting and capturing, I think that's where you see, and I think the American Medical Society or the AMA has talked about this too. It's like, how do we augment the clinician with these great tools around machine learning and ways to understand and synthesize data differently, to augment them in their decision making, to give them the value that could be generated from all this great insight, but not having them pour through and synthesize, what may be humanly impossible to synthesize the amount of data that we might be generating. And so I think there's a real nice time horizon over the next 5-10 years where the clinician hopefully will find everything we're capturing valuable for their interactions.
Excellent. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And, that's our vision as well, is to ultimately turn this data into insight that is actionable.